Hello and welcome back to the final part of Holocaust Week here on World War II TV. And we are rounding off what has been, frankly, a rather emotional week with a presentation of 10 facts. Well, you've read the title of the show already about the Holocaust, things you should know. Even myself, I found some of them was like, yeah, I didn't really know that. So it should be very informative. And our guest today, been waiting to have him on for quite some time, actually. He's taught about the Holocaust in various countries, and we'll bring him on in a minute, but he is the author of a couple of books. I only own one of them. The one I own is The Holocaust in Eastern Europe, which is a profoundly interesting read and rather harrowing, and the links to his works and his website and what have you and Twitter account are in the description below. So without further ado, I'll introduce my guest, Dr. Waitman Beorn. So good afternoon. How are you doing?
Good. I'm happy to be here. Thanks so much for having me. It's a grim topic, but I really enjoy doing this kind of thing. And of course, I live my life in scare quotes. So when I say I enjoy it, we all know what.
Yeah, we all know Alina was the same yesterday. So you are kind of renowned over the world for your understanding and teaching of the Holocaust, but also you've taught about it and learned about it in different countries. And before going live, you're currently in the UK, but you've taught in the USA. You were educated in the USA, but visited Europe as well. So before we dive into the 10 facts, is there, in your estimation, a different understanding of the Holocaust as you move from country to country, and perhaps the teaching of the Holocaust, does it vary?
I think it does. I mean, I think it varies by country, but also in some ways by the time frame that we're talking about, right? So I think a lot earlier on in the last maybe 20 years or so earlier than now, the Holocaust was often taught, if it was taught, as a completely separate sort of siloed event that is separate from the Holocaust or from the war, right? So you might take a class in World War II history or military history that wouldn't include really anything about the Holocaust. And I think one of the things that is a great sign of progress in the discipline, both in the public history sense as well as in the academic sense, is that we are recognizing that these things are connected, and that you really can't separate these two sort of massive historical events from each other. And I think one of the things that we'll probably look at today is that I think it also depends on where you are, what your perspective on the Holocaust is, in the sense of if I were to ask 10 people all around the world, what is your sort of generic archetypal image of the Holocaust? It's going to change depending on whether you're American, or British, Polish, Russian. I mean, it's all different, and we have and I'm not to say that it's necessarily biased view, but just it's a public memory that's influenced by lots of different things we'll talk about, I think.
Well, that's it. We'll go into it, but it's the films. We talked with Lucinda earlier in the week about the representation of the Holocaust on film, and it's the museums and the memorials, and indeed how many survivors or descendants of are living within a community has a huge effect as well, and what sort of spirit they have, and perhaps Israel would have a different perception to perhaps Jewish people living in New York because of just where they're growing up, and are they the main community? Are they the part, a sub community? And all those things have an impact. But anyway, we're going to get into these 10 facts, and we've got a PowerPoint that we've got to talk about it. And folks, if you have questions for Waitman or myself, but mostly for my guest, really, because I'm not the expert on this, please fire away. We'll put comments up on the screen as well while we're talking, but we'll plow through these topics. So the first one. The Holocaust was not planned as such from the beginning. This came up with Alina yesterday, I think, and I'll let you talk in a second. People have the perception of the end, towards the end, the trains, the getting off the train, straight into the extermination camps, and that it was all part of the Hitler's promise in the early days with Mein Kampf. And actually, it's a series of stages. So this was obviously the first one you chose to talk about. So let's begin with this one.
Yeah, so I mean, and just to kind of, I think, put this into context, that because I really like the way that Paul has set this up. I was kind of choosing 10 facts, but also 10 things that you may not know or may not have known, and then they're more or less sort of in chronological order. That's I'm an historian, so we have to And Paul,
some sort of structure, yeah.
Paul's a historian too, so when you do a battlefield tour, you can't start in the middle, right? So anyway, the reason that I picked this one is there's a really great Holocaust scholar who he wrote a book called The Twisted Road to Auschwitz, right? Because as Paul sort of summed up in the beginning here, there's an idea amongst a lot of people that it was sort of, this plan was on the shelf. And, as soon as the Nazis got into power, it was just a question of executing the plan. And there's a whole school of historians who necessarily didn't have perhaps that severe extreme a view of it, but who are called the intentionalists. Basically, they're historians who think that, look, the Holocaust developed because the Nazis wanted it, and they more or less were planning to do this from the beginning. The alternate view, and the one that I think is more convincing and important, is that this is a process that evolved just like anything else over time. And it goes back to, there's an argument even about Hitler's anti-Semitism and where did it come from? When can we first map it? When can we first identify it? Because one of our best sources for Hitler's anti-Semitism is Mein Kampf. In Mein Kampf, he talks about sort of his renaissance of anti-Semitism of being when he was in Austria, before the war. Of course, the problem is he's written this himself, and he's writing it many years after that in the context of being the leader of the Nazi Party, et cetera. And so it's we don't know exactly how necessarily to parse that out. But he does say in Mein Kampf at one point that, things would have been better if several 100,000 Jews had been held under gas in the First World War. And there are lots of folks that sort of take that to me, or there are not lots, but there are some who say, aha, that's the smoking gun. Hitler's always to murder Jews. But what he really meant, it was an anti-Semitic slur, but what he's actually arguing is that that Jews didn't participate in the First World War in an appropriate level, right? That they were shirking their duty, which of course is actually the complete opposite. They were overrepresented. So it's a context that's sort of taken out of context. But the point here is that, if you look at Nazi policy over time, what we can say is that they always wanted to get rid of the Jews in the sense of removing them from Germany, from the national life of Germany, and you can see that that evolution taking place. One of the real catch-22s is that a lot of the Nazi persecution and laws in that regard are designed to make life completely unbearable for Jews in Germany, and to drive them out. Of course, one of the problems is that they won't let Jews leave with any wealth. So it places Jewish Germans in this difficult situation of, well, do I want to count on that this is not going to get better and that I should leave, but I also have to give up all of my businesses and my house and all my possessions, or do I stay and sort of tough it out? What's ironic is that of the 500,000 or so Jews that were living in Germany in 1933, half of them do manage to emigrate. Half of them leave Germany. Now, granted, because of American and the other anti-Semitic immigration policies, most of them don't end up outside of Europe, so they sort of will often get caught up again in it. But they do leave, and this is a policy that continues. So Adolf Eichmann's real first job in what we'll later call the Holocaust is trying to get Jews to emigrate from Austria. So he goes to Vienna, and his job is forcing Jews to emigrate. And so then we see, and I guess I'll walk through really quickly maybe some of the alternate plans before we get to what I would call a physical solution, right? The final solution, versus what I would call territorial solutions, which is remove Jews, put them someplace else that's not Germany, right? And so the first one we see is in 1939, and it's called the Nisko Plan, or the Lublin Plan. And the idea here, and this is after the fall of Poland. And so again, here's a great point, Paul, where we see the war being directly related to the Holocaust and vice versa, right? Because now that the Nazis have conquered Poland, they have this whole new territory, which comes with its positives and negatives in the Nazi sense, right? The negative, of course, is that they go from having 250,000 Jews that they're sort of responsible for to having 3 million. So they've sort of increased their problem, if you will, massively by taking over Poland. But it also gives them a large amount of terrain and territory that they can use. And so the plan is to deport Jews from Germany and newly occupied parts of Europe and bring them to a place called a district called Lublin, which is in Poland. And I think we have an image of one of the camps that's set up to do this. And this is it's one of these, it's a great example of sort of the ideal versus the practical. What the Nazis discover, because while they're trying to do this at the same time, what they're also trying to do is to import or to settle these new Polish territories with Germans or ethnic Germans. And so they're trying to do sort of this two-way and demographic engineering project, and they just don't have the means to do it. And so it doesn't really come off very well, not least because Hans Frank, who is the Nazi administrator of the general government in what is occupied Poland, experiences sort of a not in my backyard problem, where he doesn't want, he's trying to make his best Nazi sort of territory, and he doesn't want it to be a dumping ground for Jews from all over Europe. And so there's some Nazi bureaucratic infighting that essentially kills this project as well. So then if we advance in time a little bit, the second major plan is called the Madagascar Plan. And again, this is something that it doesn't spring fully formed from the Nazis. There were ideas earlier on in history of forcing all of the Jews of Europe to go live on the island of Madagascar off the eastern coast of Africa, eastern coast of Africa. So it's not, but the Nazis pick up on this. And so that's their next plan is, okay, now we're talking 1940, right? Madagascar is now available because France has fallen. So as a French territory, it falls to the Nazis. And their idea is, okay, so now we're going to take all the Jews of Europe and we're going to dump them on the island of Madagascar. Now, to be clear, neither of these plans so far is a benign one. They're not nice. And lots of Jews, lots of people, women and children and men will die of disease and starvation, et cetera, from either of these plans. But neither of them envisions a systematic extermination, systematic killing. It's, again, a physical removal of them, territorial removal from Germany and from occupied the lands that are now sort of the German Reich. And of course, and it's clear, I should point out, it should be important to realize that these are not sort of pie in the sky plans. There are whole administrative offices that are trying to plan logistically, how will we do this? How will we get people from here to there? So it's not just kind of an imaginary idea. Of course, the war also intervenes here, right? One of the there are really, I guess, two main reasons why the Madagascar plan fails. One is, of course, that the Nazis are never going to have control of the seas. So they're not going to be able to move ships to Madagascar full of Jews. And secondly, they simply don't have the shipping to do this anyway. So this is a plan that sort of falls apart as realities of war become apparent. And the last moment before we get to what we'll call the final solution, which is a physical extermination, and it's much more hazy because it doesn't really stay as a possibility for very long. It's called the Urals Plan. The idea is to during the invasion of the Soviet Union, once the Nazis really only care about what we might call European Russia. So Russia up to Moscow and the Urals. They don't really care so much about, Siberia and the stands and all of that. And so the idea is that the Urals will form sort of this natural boundary of the Third Reich, and they will dump all the Jews and other undesirable groups of people on the eastern side of the Urals. And then the Urals sort of stand as this Hadrian's Wall, this Roman sort of frontier where the German young men can go and serve for a period of time and blood themselves before coming back and settling. And of course, the problem with this plan is that the Soviets don't cooperate, and the Nazis never get to the Urals, and we never have a sort of solid boundary. And that brings us up to the point where we can actually see some pretty clear changes in the mindset of the leadership, and a shift towards a physical solution, right? And it should be clear to point. I should point out also that this doesn't mean that Hitler was against the final solution, right? He certainly was. None of these major changes and evolutions towards gas chambers and mass shooting would have happened without his approval. We just don't have an actual order, a document someplace that says, now is the time to murder all the Jews, signed Hitler. But we can see some important changes, like in October of 1941, when Jewish immigration is finally outlawed. And so this is one of the ironies, is that Jews are theoretically legally allowed to leave Germany up until October of 1941. Now, whether in practice that happens or not is a different story. But the fact that there's now a moment where the Nazis have said no, which essentially translates to why allow them to go someplace else when we're just going to have to round them up again. And then, of course, in this time, you start to see the creation, or the orders for the creation of the extermination centers and things like this. So anyway, that's the first one, I think, and that's important.
Well, I think it's an important one to discuss, because again, we're talking about perceptions of the general public, and indeed myself. It's that the idea that killing a certain, not just the Jewish population, but the others that were swept up in, it seems that it's a simple, like everyone's having a meeting, let's just kill them. But it's often an efficiency issue. It's actually trying to find the solutions they've looked at just aren't feasible. They all fall down the logistics spaces. And this came up when Alina's talk yesterday about the first use of gas at Auschwitz. It was trying to solve an immediate problem that then in turn ended up becoming a solution to a greater problem, but they didn't necessarily anticipate it coming. And and at no point are we saying that the Germans aren't truly horrible in their intentions, and but it's just being clear that this is a process of an evolution of ideas, as opposed to just a single meeting. Although, of course, we have the Wannsee conference in 42, but that's later in the deal. But
that's an important thing to bring up. I'm really glad you mentioned that, because Wannsee is originally scheduled for December of 1941, and it gets moved because of this whole Pearl Harbor and America entering the war. And so that's why it gets kicked to January, right? And one of the interesting things about Wannsee that gets exactly to your point, Paul, is the Wannsee conference, while many people think that Wannsee was the moment where they sat down and said, okay, now we're going to do the final solution. We're going to do an extermination project. Of course, they'd already decided that much earlier. Wannsee is an implementation conference, and it speaks to all of these ideas that you just mentioned. Because it's one thing to say we're going to get rid of all the Jews, but it's a fundamentally different thing when you actually have to ask a bureaucrat or somebody to actually do that. And so they're literally sitting down with lawyers to determine, okay, what is the citizenship status? They're talking to transportation experts, talking to economic ministers. What are all the impacts of this? How do we manage this so it becomes, as you say, a very obviously grim and awful problem, but it's simply a problem that they're trying to solve.
It's a logistics and problem in some ways, and transportation and bureaucracy problem. I mean, that when Dr. Philip Blab was on a few weeks ago talking about the SS, and there's elements of their organization that it works efficiently, but there's also lots of departments, lots of no one knows quite who's in charge of what. And in order for this to be implemented, a single system has to be introduced to streamline it, to make it possible. Otherwise, you'd have all these bureaucratic departments working against each other, which in a weird parallel, when we talk about the Allies in 1944, probably the best thing about Schaefer and Eisenhower is everybody knows exactly what their role is, what they're supposed to be in charge of, and where their responsibility stops. And I think when you look at the Third Reich, through much of its history, there's a real misunderstanding of who exactly is in charge of what. And when your resources are being limited, as happens later in the war, any improvement of efficiency is going to help the war effort, which of course ties up this theme about the Holocaust and the war not being separate. They are the same thing.
Yeah, and even there you have, I mean, that's the thing is, of course, Hitler's management style, if we can call it that, was basically avoiding any one of his underlings rising to sort of a permanent secondary position, right, as his deputy. And so he encourages his subordinates to fight with each other to sort of gain his favor, which is, again, not a great leadership technique, because it leads to people working at cross purposes, right? And of course, here we're talking about an incredibly awful and immoral genocidal project, but you had people fighting over, there was one branch of the SS that was like, let's wait until after the war to kill all the Jews because we can use them as labor. And there was a second branch of the SS that was the more extreme that said, no, it's an ideological race war. We need to do it now. And so there's all kinds of infighting that goes on and has impacts as well at the on the ground level.
And just before we move on, I got a question from Roman, that was a friend of mine in Normandy, about public opinion. So as they're evolving these ideas, how much consideration is there about what the public would think about program as they instigate?
This is a fantastic question, and it's another thing that I think is I really appreciate this question because it highlights again the what we might call sort of the I'm trying to think of what the word I'm trying to think of, the contingent nature of how the Holocaust develops, right? I would argue, and Hitler knows this too, right? Hitler is not an unastute politician. I mean, he knows what he's doing in terms of ushering in a lot of this anti-Jewish measures and persecution. I mean, if you look at his messages before 1938, and so he's very much more anti-communist in a public sense. He recognizes that some people maybe find anti-Semitism crude, even if they agree with it, right? So he does have his finger on, he's interested in basically what he can get away with. And that does, in some ways, guide the escalation of
and that's a standard kind of political practice, is you introduce your tougher measures incrementally. It's the putting a frog into the boiling water thing, the analogy, isn't it? If you just keep, well, we got away with that one, and you crank it up slightly, slide another one, then, well, we got away with that one. And if you had implemented them all in one phase, people are going to go, hang on, you can't do that. But you do it in such a way as you barely notice the changes.
Yes, and one of the things that Hitler learns from the Beorn Putsch, both politically, I think, and in general, is that he has to do things legally in a certain sense. I mean, a lot of things he does are still illegal even under German law, but he gets laws behind that back, his escalating persecutions. And even he sometimes, chastises his own subordinates. In 1933, when they had the boycott, it was in many ways a sort of a massive failure. He wanted all the Germans to boycott Jewish businesses, and he didn't really get the buy-in that he was hoping to get. Not to mention there was a grave economic disruption, and a lot of people just kind of ignored that and went to their local shop, whether it was owned by a Jew or not. And he got upset about that and sort of cussed Goebbels out over it. But things like Kristallnacht that Roman mentions are important, because while there were some Germans that were upset, many of them were more upset about kind of the lawless nature of it, sort of the violence in the streets and the burning of things, rather than the actual message behind it. But if you want to see a great example of sort of this interest in public opinion, you can only look at the T4 program, the so-called euthanasia program, which gets outed in the public. And you have Bishop Galen, a Catholic bishop, who is preaching against it, to the extent that Hitler is forced to at least publicly end the program. Now he doesn't; it becomes decentralized and it carries on. But the Nazis are aware, and they don't want to lose the public. They're not going to ever inform the public completely. They don't need them to buy into Auschwitz, but they're not going to they don't want to lose them because they know about Auschwitz either. So they do.
It's complicated. Well, that first point was probably the toughest and longest, most complicated one we're going to tackle, but we'll keep on moving. So number 2, perhaps as many as a third of the victims died during the Holocaust by bullets, not in gas chambers. And this is echoing what we were saying previously in the week, is that's, again, the public perception is it's the trains, gas chambers, but of course the early stages was very different. So elaborate on that, please.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is, again, one of those areas that I think in the public sense, in the public sphere, is mediated by memory, right? And this applies to a lot of the things that we're going to talk about today. The image that we often have of the Holocaust is concentration camps, Many of them in Germany, the German concentration camps liberated by the Allies, the Western
because of the film, because of the coverage at the time, I think,
because the film and also because that was many people's last experiences of the Holocaust. Even if they had experienced or escaped from the mass shootings, they end up in a camp someplace. They're liberated from that, and so that becomes kind of the image that we have. Not to mention that there are, in some ways, fewer survivors of these mass shootings who can testify about it versus survivors of the camps. And many of those that did survive end up behind the Iron Curtain until 1989. And so their stories are suppressed both politically and also just geographically. But it's important to realize, and I mentioned earlier with the planning, one of the moments that we can point to as a key turning point where we know that the Nazis have decided to move to this physical extermination process is in July of 1941. So only a month into the invasion of the Soviet Union, we see the Einsatzgruppen, these mobile killing units, which existed in Poland and did similar things, but were more restrained. In the Soviet Union in July of 1941, they are now murdering men, women, and children of all ages. And even in June, when they had entered into the Soviet Union, their initial brief was Jewish men of military age, right? So there's still this sort of fig leaf of potential enemies, or potential partisans or resistance. Starting with the SS cavalry regiments in Belarus, and then moving all the way through with the other Einsatzgruppen units, you start to see in July, August, September, the shootings become indiscriminate in that sense. And so when we go back to the numbers, around 2.5 million Jews are murdered, by bullets, by shooting, face-to-face killings by Germans shooting, and others, German and auxiliaries, shooting them into pits. And we see, two images here, and I think we can see a really quick film, which I'll introduce in a minute. And this is also something that goes after, it continues after the camps or the extermination.
Is it fair to say, Waitman, that that although this kind of started off in Poland, one of the reasons it didn't get completely out of hand in Poland, although I'm not dismissing the horrible murders there, is because of this sense that Poland was going to become a place of Aryan interest as well. So they don't want to completely go to town with this horrible policy there because of, as you said earlier, this contrast between they want to use Poland for German people to live, and they also want to eradicate people from the undesirables from Poland. So the Einsatzgruppen were a bit kind of restrained there because of that balance. Whereas once they get to Barbarossa and Soviet Union, there's no holds barred now. You can crank it up to the next level.
Well, I think what we might say is that, again, this is it's an issue of chronology, right? So Poland is occupied in 1939. Obviously through 1940, et cetera. And up until that point, the decision hadn't been made to physically exterminate the Jews. And so what you see in Poland is a ghettoization.
Yeah, and it was still trying to eradicate a perceived threat as opposed to...
And so then you see the ghettoization project, but then by the time of the invasion of the Soviet Union, you start to see the decision has been made for extermination. And so there's actually a wave that comes back into Poland of the mass killing. But by that point, a lot of the extermination centers are now in operation. And of course, when we're talking about Poland, that already is issues of like what geography are we talking about? Because parts of what was Poland become what we call incorporated territories, meaning they directly become part of Germany, and they have slightly different modes of administration and governance. Others are the general government, but then there's a whole swath of what was Poland that is in what was then Ukraine or part of the Soviet Union. And so it can be a little more complicated, but what you basically have is the first mass shootings, like at the scale of the Einsatzgruppen in the Soviet Union, take place there. And then what you have that a lot of people don't even talk about is in 1943-44, there's a wave that comes back the other direction as the remaining ghettos are liquidated. A lot of that often takes place by shootings as well. So shootings kind of bookend the sort of industrialized extermination centers killing in the middle, if that makes sense.
But when you said we introduced the clip now, this is one of the only surviving bits of clip of this. And the quality is very poor, but where was this taken?
So this is a really, again, I live my life in scare quotes, but a really, really fascinating and important image. It was taken by a German who was there watching at a place called Liepaja in Latvia in 1941. And what you're seeing is local auxiliaries. So the guys with the armbands, the white armbands, are Latvians. They're not Nazis. And these trucks have showed up, and they're taking the Jews who are wearing these badges. Notice again, these badges they're not yellow stars. It's improvised, right? And they're leading them to a shooting pit where an Einsatzgruppen unit is shooting them. And what is I think so important about this is if you look at all the people watching, you have this little dog running around just to add sort of a surreal element of normality to this. There are off-duty soldiers. There are locals. If you see very up on that ridge behind the shooting pit, there are lots of people just kind of like a Sunday outing, as well as
almost looks like they're trying to get a better view. Some of them, they're kind of craning their necks because the guy in front is blocking their view slightly from the spectacle.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's interesting, of course, is that the German that recorded this footage, and again, it's the only real film footage that we have of one of these shootings, took it to a local to develop it, and the local film developer made a copy of it, which he then turned over to the Germans after the war, and it was used to prosecute some of the perpetrators of this particular execution. But it really gives a good sense, and I know it's grim and gruesome, but we're talking about mass shootings of thousands of people in a day, just over and over and over and over again, every day on the Eastern Front, or in occupied Poland or in Ukraine. I mean, it's a systematic issue, a systematic method of doing it, but it also feeds into a desire for, as you point out earlier, a more important or a more efficient way of doing it. Right?
Mary Buckman asked, do we know why that German was filming it? Was it just souvenir? Was it for kind of official record? What's the story?
Yeah. Hi, Mary. I know Mary from the We Have Ways podcast.
Yeah,
as well.
Of course.
For coming. Yeah. So, I mean, we don't know because he wasn't, I guess I can go back. He wasn't an official photographer. So my guess, which is as good as any's, I suppose, is that, he was in some ways a tourist. Now I think he was in the military, in a military organization. I don't know which, or some kind of Nazi organization. So he wasn't just on tour, but he was a spectator. And we do have lots of photos of lots of different executions and persecutions of Jews taken by just people, German soldiers, that happen to be there.
I mean, in the same way, without people take footage of disasters today, don't they? It's an instinct. Is people put their cameras on and their phones on when there's a volcano or there's a disaster. It's maybe a human interest in the macabre at some level, which will come as to other themes about the people behind the Holocaust and the perpetrators being in some ways normal. We'll get to that later on, but I suppose if there's something odd, unusual happening, there is some weird subliminal inbuilt interest to kind of watch it. I don't.
It is. That's a really important point. And the user here, USG64, mentions a really important point, which is that, yeah, I mean, they were not, the German military eventually had to issue orders not to take pictures. And of course, if you know anything about the military, you rarely have an order if there's not a reason behind it. So that there clearly was a problem with people taking pictures. And this coincides with an important development in the history of photography, which is the 35 millimeter camera. This is the first war where everybody could bring a camera more or less with them if they wanted to. And in Germany in particular, Germans had lots of cameras. But I think your point is really important about photographs as sources. It's tempting to attribute any kind of photograph of atrocity as a acceptance or condoning it, but it's difficult to know whether that's true or not without knowing who took the photograph and why. Certainly, some of them did. Some of them sent them home as trophies. We see that not just with the Nazis, but with Americans and their reason for taking it is something they may well change
in the telling of the story as well.
Yes.
You know, so what they may say in the interview later on and what they felt at the time. I mean, I know that's another it's a potential rabbit hole to go
Yes.
down there, but
Yeah.
it does raise the question of exactly how these photos exist, and also on a broader level, how comparatively few photos and bits of footage we have really of mass extermination. So, you know, when we even something like D-Day or Market Garden, it's dozens of photos we have rather than thousands. So
Right.
how much understanding comes from a source that actually is quite small. You know, what conclusions you can draw from images. The archival research perhaps is going to give a truer picture. The pictures can be misleading in that regard. But anyway, we'll move on. So,
and it's a brilliant point. Just to finish with that, I mean, you know, it's a brilliant point you just make, because whenever you take a photograph, you are at the time of the history you're editing.
Yeah, you know, you're choosing what to frame. Yeah,
leaving something out, right? Yeah.
Why take that moment and not the moment before? I mean, it's different now because we can bash away 50 shots in a few minutes with our phones, but back then, when film was precious, you're kind of waiting for what is it you're trying to capture here? How long were you at the event? Were you there 2 hours? You take 4 photos. How much of a representation is that 4 photos of the event? I mean, of course, with that footage, there's no disguising what was going on there. Whether he'd got a 30-minute clip or a minute-long clip, it's not going to conceal or cover up or the events there. But moving along. So number 3, the Reinhard camps, which is something that I think is important to understand. So I'll let you elaborate on that.
Yeah, I mean, this is a potentially, you know, slightly shorter segment, which is probably fine. A lot of people, and this is, I think, again, part of a public memory issue, is that Auschwitz forms sort of the occupies the most public memory space when it comes to we talking actually about the final solution. And then quite often, the concentration camps in Germany occupy the rest of it. So you sort of have Auschwitz and then Bergen-Belsen and Buchenwald and Dachau and these kind of things. I think it's important that everybody who is interested in this topic is able to distinguish between an extermination center and a concentration camp. You know, there are 30 to 40,000 concentration camps that the Germans set up all over Europe. They are all awful places. People die in all of them. People are murdered in all of them. But there are only really 5 that function essentially, who have their entire job is purely to murder people. Auschwitz is an outlier there because Auschwitz is also a labor camp and a factory camp, right? But this is why you'll never catch me using the word death camps, because they're all death camps. But only this group of camps were set up specifically and only to murder predominantly Jews. And the three that fall into the Action Reinhard camps are Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec. And into this pantheon of sort of the extermination centers, we will also add Chelmno, the earliest, that started in December 8th of 1941, and Auschwitz, which, like I said, it serves both of these purposes at the same time. But you know, if we look at the numbers, 1.6 million Jews are murdered in the Reinhard camps, and 1.1 million are murdered in Auschwitz. And this isn't a competition, but there's a really key quote from scholar Christopher Browning, who writes essentially that in mid-March of 1942, of all of the Jews that would be murdered during the Holocaust, 75% were still alive and 25% had been killed. By about less than a year later, in spring of 1943, that percentage is completely reversed. And of all the Jews that will die during the Holocaust, 75% have already been murdered. And, you know, this is really important because most of that killing is taking place in these Reinhard camps and also in the mass shootings, right? Because most of these Reinhard camps close by the end of 42, beginning of 1943. What I think is really powerful about these places is their size, because they're tiny. You know, you could walk the entire perimeter of Treblinka in, you know, maybe 45 minutes. And that's walking all the way around the outside of it. And yet 850,000 human beings are murdered there. And I don't know if this, so this map has a scale. So if you just look, at the scale, the scale is in hundreds of meters. It's a very tiny place, but it's a place that only exists to kill people. You see right there on the map, the train pulls right in to the reception camp. There's a selection. Those two barracks there, 29 and 28, are used for hair cutting and searching for valuables, this kind of thing. And then they go right through the tube there into what's called in Treblinka, the death camp, which is where the gas chambers are. There's no crematorium. The bodies are burned in the open. And it's carbon monoxide gas, which again is a fact that many people don't know, which is that it was really only Auschwitz and then the Majdanek camp that used Zyklon B. So the majority of people who were gassed by the Nazis died of carbon monoxide. And an ironic connection to the war here also is that in Sobibor, it's quite likely that it was a Soviet tank engine or U-boat engine that was used to create the gas. But anyway, I thought it's really important because, and here we have Sobibor again, and you can actually see a prisoner up there in the upper left corner. This picture was taken from one of the guard towers, and you see Travniki men, which we'll talk about in a minute, but they're local auxiliaries patrolling that outer perimeter. But they're very small places. But one of the connections, and this is the last thing I'll say about this, pending questions, is what you see here. I talked about a minute ago about the euthanasia program, and all of the men and women of that program, many of the men and women of that program, were put out of business by Hitler's sort of temporary halting of the process. But these are people who have a particular set of skills. They know how to murder people in large numbers, how to get them from outlying facilities to a central facility, and how to cover it up. So it's not surprising that many of them end up working in these Reinhard camps. So a guy like Franz Stangl, commandant of Sobibor, later commandant of Treblinka, was originally a worker in a euthanasia hospital in Germany. So,
and just a little side question that I don't necessarily I need a big response to it, but a quick one is that when you're educating about the Holocaust now, and we know, of course, that the way to convey the horror is the personal accounts of survivors, and Lena was talking about some of the accounts that we had yesterday in the Auschwitz show, but how important is it, and how difficult is it to then bring up in the middle of someone explaining about something emotional the distinction between concentration camp and extermination camp, and that this one was Zyklon B and this one was carbon monoxide, because those details are really important for us to understand the mechanism of the process, but they're not in a sense important in understanding the harrowing and emotional nature of it. But do you sometimes in an educational role feel the need to kind of just shut up because the emotional, you don't want to spoil the emotional nature of something by being Mr. Geek about the finer details?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. And, Holocaust survivors will often get things wrong historically, just like veterans will, right? About their experience. And, there's really never need for me to correct them, while they're giving testimony or something like that. I mean, because the point is not that their parents were murdered with carbon monoxide or Zyklon B, right? I mean, that's not the point of their testimony. So I think when you're teaching about it, like I'm doing now, I'm sort of teaching, I suppose. And so now I'm trying to be as precise as possible for all kinds of reasons, not least, Holocaust deniers like to jump on stuff like this. But yeah, I mean, the emotional nature, the cold hard facts of what happened to human beings, are sort of indisputable, right?
Yeah.
But we'll talk when we talk about the details because they matter, but they don't necessarily matter in the sense of correcting people.
No, it's just balancing those things, as tour guides, educators, however, our various people watching this, educate people about World War II, whether it's professionally, whether it's via filmmakers, all those things there. We're all balancing those emotional emotional teaching with factual teaching and trying to convey things. And it's not always an easy task and a thing to juggle. But and then, we touched on this one, number 4 already. You talked about the location of where this is, but the Holocaust was predominantly an Eastern European event. Now, as it happened, 3 of the shows I did this week ended up covering the Holocaust in France, and that's just how it happened with people I was contact with, and I happen to live in France. But of course, that is not the major area where this has happened. And again, you were talking about the fact that post-war, there's the Soviet Union, there's communism, there's censorship. So this maybe hasn't always been clear to people understanding it, I think.
Yeah, and I want to preface this by saying, I mean, because I as you point out so nicely, I wrote a book called The Holocaust in Eastern Europe. I'm sort of a cheerleader for recognizing the importance of Eastern Europe and the Holocaust. But in no way is this an Olympics of suffering, where
it's not a competition. Yeah.
One is worse than the other. But it's a great example academically of just the way that popular perception and memory works. Because as we mentioned, we have in the Allied world, we have the liberation of the camps video or films, and we have many of the survivors again have had that camp experience, et cetera, or come from or have family in these sort of Western countries or I put rest of Europe because Greece. What do I do with Greece, and what do I do with places like that? But if you look at the raw numbers, and I should mention Anne Frank as well. I am not an anti-Anne Frank person by any stretch, but she occupies a huge amount of memory for folks. I suspect that many of our viewers have read the Diary of Anne Frank, and it's super important. But Anne Frank is, if we look at the Holocaust, is an absolute outlier. If I was going to create a sort of composite typical victim of the Holocaust, they are not a upper middle class, non-observant, assimilated Jew. They're likely in Eastern Europe. They likely are potentially rural, potentially much more religiously observant than Western Europeans, and have had probably had a much different experience of their death and of their persecution. And I always mention, I should point this out before I finish here, there's no such thing as the Holocaust in the sense of one sort of shared common experience. I always say there are 6 million Holocausts because everybody who lives and dies has a different experience, whether it's, you're deported from Netherlands and you die of typhoid, or you survive Auschwitz but die on a death march, or if you're shot in a pit in Ukraine, or you die, in a ghetto in Warsaw. I mean, they're all fundamentally different. But it is important, I think, to highlight just the numbers here, the sheer numbers. And again, these numbers come from the Holocaust Museum. They're not, and I had to play a little bit with, adding in which territories were which at the time. But the numbers are really staggering if you think about it. So my current book project centers on the city of Lviv in Ukraine, and the Lviv ghetto had 160,000 Jews in it, which is more than the entire Jewish population of the Netherlands. So I mean, it's an Eastern European experience, which is why the camps the extermination camps are located where they are. It's also why, we'll talk about this in a minute, why the participation of locals is so incredibly important. And it takes an outsized importance in Eastern Europe because that's also where all the Jews happen to be.
Yeah. But it also, in a weird way, for people to understand these horrors, the easiest way is to compare it with something you're more familiar with. So if you are a young Dutch person today, understanding Anne Frank's experience is going to relate to you easier than understanding Ukrainian peasants' experience, even if there's no difference in the horror, there's no difference in the outcome. But so in terms of educationally, it's better to use a source that makes that connection somehow. So you go, well, I can imagine that happening to me. I've seen these streets. So it does, in the end, I suppose, mean that the teaching of it, which was my first question to you, so it does end up being kind of localized because of the sources and how you're trying to convey, and your audience. Who are you teaching the Holocaust to, and what tools are you going to use to make it relatable for them.
I mean, I think you're right. I mean, I also think that it works both ways, because if you read a diary account of there's several great ones. One is called the Diary of Samuel Goldfarb, which is a nice, sort of annotated version. You know, once you get past the fact that this person lives in the Ukraine, the experiences of of their parents, of their daily lives are quite similar to what we can relate to them. They're not so exotic and so foreign.
Yeah, fear, loss, and anger, all those emotions are universal, aren't they? So in that sense, there's no difference. But yeah.
And this gets to the last question. The last we've been talking about this public memory piece, which is simply that these are stories that, for some of the reasons that you mentioned and some of the reasons that your viewers have mentioned, these are stories that don't get out of Eastern Europe for quite some time. And so, we pick up on other stories that and this happens with every historical event. Certain narratives or moments dominate, which may or may not be the most important or the most representative.
And that had come up on so many World War II TV shows. It's that single timeline we seem to only better cope with. So if there's one major event happening in a particular week in World War II, a second or third event happening somehow gets lost because the first one overshadows the others. And you get that. People have that single timeline they follow where events go from Pearl Harbor and Midway and so and D-Day and Stalingrad, whatever it would be in that order there. And the other things just somehow often don't get reference in that same way. So yeah, that makes sense.
And I feel like that's also the case in some ways just with military history up until recently. I mean, I felt like that the Eastern Front, even from a military history perspective, got short shrift, up until the last 20 years or so for all kinds of reasons.
It's booming now, I think. And it's also because of people like Prit Buttar and others and the Australian historians and Jason Mark doing their work because they've learned Russian, they've learned German, and there's archives available. The digitalization of archives, the access to archives has improved the Western study of the Eastern Front fighting. So I think that's an area where I think it's going to get better and better. And then, of course, we're going to the subcontinent, India and Pakistan. That's going to be a boom area for new information. But we digress. So we've touched on this one already. So number 5 is the non-German participation being essential for the execution of the Holocaust. So you touched on this when we had the video with the Latvian guards there. So this is obviously something you wanted to include. This is one of your 10. Why is it important that we know this?
Well, I think so. I'll try to be a little more succinct, which is difficult for me, clearly. But I think that it's important to realize that as bad as the Nazis were, and they are bad, and here we see an image of two German policemen, or a German policeman and a Ukrainian policeman at a sort of joint militia post. But the Holocaust it would have taken place regardless, but it got a lot of help from local people, and I want to break down the way that local people participated into sort of 3 quick categories, because we have this really complex issue of collaboration, and what does that mean, versus sort of complicity, maybe opportunism, particularly, and it's gotten particularly fraught in the case of Poland, which has kind of a memory interest in trying to play down any kind of complicity or accommodation and play up its own suffering. I think that happens also in Western Europe. But I'll look at it as this. There's a willingness to participate, a willingness to benefit, and or the creation of a hostile environment. And all of these things end up helping the Nazis carry out the goals that they're trying to accomplish. And they're not all equally present in every place, in every time, but they're sort of the different ways in which either wittingly or unwittingly or intentionally or unintentionally, the behavior of local non-Jewish populations is critical, right? And so the most obvious version, and I'll come to this image in a moment, but the most obvious, there are what we call the Travniki men, who are recruited from non-ethnic Russians in Soviet prisoners of war camps, predominantly. So they're looking for Ukrainians, Belarusians, Lithuanians, who are given the option of leaving sort of the certain death of a Nazi POW camp, because we haven't mentioned yet what I call another genocide, which is that of the Soviet prisoners of war. But I digress. They're given the options of leaving those environments if they agree to serve as an auxiliary, and many of them are then posted to places like Sobibor, Treblinka, and they are the ones that end up quite often doing what we might call the heavy lifting, and also the more gratuitously awful work in an extermination center. So we have those groups. We then have other militias made up often of nationalists in places like the Baltic states and Ukraine, who think that by currying favor with the Nazis, they can advance a national political agenda. They often also get involved as shooters in the Holocaust by bullets, but they're also actively engaged. Then we have folks like this, and this happens all over Eastern Europe and all over Western Europe too, actually, where there are people who are completely happy to benefit from the plight of the Jews, whether it be by taking their property, here's an auction of personal property, but also businesses, residences, etc. And then the last thing I mentioned is this hostile environment, and this applies in a great way to Poland, though we also see people, anti-Semitic people in Poland, informing on people that are hiding and this kind of stuff, and to a certain smaller extent, actually working with the Nazis. But when you have a predominating environment of anti-Semitism, it makes an escape from a camp or a ghetto, or the possibility of living outside of those places, much more difficult. And that also obviously assists the Nazis, because it prevents the Jews from finding, workable means of escape, to the extent that in some parts of Poland, you had Jews buying their way into factory camps because it was safer for them there than living outside in hiding. So I mean, there are lots of different ways in which, and then we haven't talked about actual nation states like Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, which are kind of independent satellite states, but are actively also supporting at different times and places the Nazi project.
And that that would break down and go down other tangents and avenues, because their reasons are different, and they change as the war moves on. And it would be we could do a whole show about the countries that are part of the Axis, that are not the ones you think of immediately, that are part of the process, and their motivations are all different. And it's another interesting discussion that would be.
The critical piece here to mention simply is that, and the reason to mention this is that anti-Semitism, number one, certainly predates the Nazis, but it's also not a German thing. I mean, all of these countries in Eastern Europe and Western Europe, have their own anti-Semitisms, and for those people that are anti-Semitic, the Nazis and World War II offers an opportunity to act on that. And so that's an important motivation in and of itself. Beyond,
I mean, and that came up in our shows about France, the late 19th century anti-Semitism and things like that. That the Third Reich and the Germans just built on an existing hatred, and that's something that we still see today. Is there are already underlying tensions, and someone comes in and builds on something that was already in place. It's easier to do that than establish a new set of kind of hateful values. You just build on something that's there. But these images here, the image on the left, and we've got a bit of film again. I mean, particularly emotional and graphic, that photo there. So this is the city you're writing about, isn't it?
Yes. And again, here this is in July of 1941, just after the Nazis arrive in Lviv. And, these are not Nazis. These are not Germans. These are locals who are, in very personal ways, attacking Jews.
We'll play the footage now. I mean, and we had a show where we talked about an American air crew shot down in Germany in the latter part of the war, and how the locals just kind of set about them and started beating them up with fists and shovels and things. It's like normal people sometimes bought into this. And
here, just to interrupt real quickly, this is also in Lviv, and the Nazis are filming this, by the way. That's where this is official to be used. But what you're having here are victims of the Soviets. That's the bodies. The dead bodies are people that were killed by the Soviets before they left Lviv. And the Jews are being forced to excavate the bodies and this kind of stuff, which again speaks to this idea that they were in some way behind it, which they weren't. But it's also anti-Semitic, right? And then, of course, you see people. This is a prison, this image right here. And then, this man this regular guy just with a stick beating a Jewish man, and chasing them around. And again, the Nazis are happy to let this happen and would actually have been happier if more of this had happened. But they're not forcing them to do this.
I know that makes it more. It just makes it equally shocking and horrific. And yeah, again, we knew this would be a difficult show to go through in some ways, but yeah, it's the reminders of this are just awful. Yeah. So we'll move on because time is ever running. So this is a really fascinating one because immediately when I saw this, when you sent this to me, it reminded me of this when Guy Walters, the historian, sort of discovered that there isn't in existence this idea that an Allied officer should escape from a prisoner of war camp. It's one of those tropes that we kind of have all come to believe, and every war film has some. You'll be, sent off to the Russian front for this. You'll be, there's a punishment system in place. So you obviously wanted to include this, and what's the background behind it?
Well, I think it's really important because not least the Nazis themselves after the war, want to use this as their justification for participation. I would have been killed if I hadn't done X, Y, or Z. If I hadn't participated in shooting, or if I hadn't murdered that Jew, they would have put me up against the wall next. And what's really important is this is not hyperbole, right? Because had a German defense attorney in the post-war period been able to find one instance of a German being shot or executed for refusing to participate in killing, it would have been brilliant. I mean, that would have been the best thing for all Nazis accused on the stand, because they could have then said, look, this actually happened.
Yeah.
So you had historians who are just engaging in research, kind of looking at this, but also very motivated people looking for this. And we have no evidence that this happened. Now, I don't want to go into overly gross amounts of detail. It doesn't mean that there weren't Germans that were murdered or killed for helping Jews. That absolutely happened. But mostly it was people who, number one, encouraged other people to refuse. So there are a couple examples of German officers who, lieutenants in the Wehrmacht, for example, who tried to get their soldiers to also not participate. And one of them was executed for this. Another guy named Anton Schmid stole a Wehrmacht truck and was using it to transport Jews to Soviet territory and back. He got killed for that because it rose above a level of individual refusal. And it rose into for some people it's an idea of like mutiny and what the German is Wehrkraftzersetzung, or sort of destruction of sort of war morale. Like if you're doing something to sort of hurt the war effort, right? But when it comes down to the question of a soldier, even an SS guy, being ordered to shoot someone else or work in the gas chamber or whatever else, if they refused to do it, they were not killed. They some things could happen to them. They could be transferred someplace else. They could theoretically be transferred to the Eastern Front, but most of these guys are already on the Eastern Front, so that's not really going to help them. They could be made fun of, but there's very little. There's no evidence really of a lot of legal or judicial punishment for people like this. Mostly, they were allowed to do something different. And one of the reasons, of course, is that there was always someone who was willing to do it, so that it was never an issue. They could, and of course, this doesn't necessarily mean even that those that refused to participate were amazing moral people, because sometimes they didn't have to shoot anymore; they just had to guard the Jews before they were shot. So, yes, you're not
change their place on the production line. So
yes, but you're still involved in it, right? But it's a pivotal point that we have this image of the Nazis as this super draconian organization that was killing everybody, and you couldn't say no, but you really could. And it's important to note that 15,000 German soldiers are executed just for desertion alone, and probably 30 or 40,000 more for all kinds of other minor offenses. So it's not like the Germans were nice when it came to refusing orders. But in this case, I think they knew they didn't have to sort of force the people that way.
It's just which dovetails nicely and connects with the next thing about because you said about the morality behind it, that we touched on this earlier about the most perpetrators were psychologically normal people. Now, that's an intriguing one. And so what's the evidence for this? What studies have been done? I suppose is a better question, I think.
I'm not going to point to some of the Gilbert Nuremberg, interviews because those guys are like the main perpetrators and that kind of thing. I think one of the arguments is just it's human nature. If you look at, for example, the Zimbardo experiment, the Zimbardo prison experiment at Stanford in the 60s or 70s, the Milgram experiments, just lots of work that's been done on social psychology shows that you don't need to be what I would call a sociopath. In other words, someone who is incapable of empathizing with the feelings of other people, or a psychopath, or someone who is, as I said, clinically psychologically deranged, to participate in mass killing. And to me, that's the most chilling, one of the most chilling sort of lessons, if you will, of the Holocaust itself. I came across in my work so many men who participated in murdering women and children simply because they didn't want their peers to think they were weak. So just the same kind of peer pressure that would get you to do something stupid at the pub, when you're drunk, was also working to get people murdered. I think for some of us, for me too, there's a certain comfort in fanatics. I can understand. I don't obviously agree with, but I can understand someone who just holds a fanatical devotion to something.
It's like with a serial killer. When I'm going off on a bit of a tangent. When a serial killer is brought to justice, we all kind of breathe a sigh of relief when they find that he had albums of photos of dead people, because he was weird then. We hate it when they're in any way normal. But we all kind of breathe a sigh of relief where he was just a complete evil nutter. That's how we like them to be. We can take that idea on board better than we can that it's just like our next door neighbor, the same kind of guy we could go to the pub with, who's normal. That person being murdering people is difficult to take on board. And I think on a bigger level, the same thing applies to the Nazis. We like to think they're all just fuckwits, is the word I would use.
And this was helpful after the war. We'll get to in a minute for Germans as well, because they could say, well, it wasn't really us. It was these crazy SS guys, crazy Nazis.
Yeah, it was this minority. Yeah.
And there's also some really good anecdotal evidence, of sort of psychosomatic reactions of people. So even Himmler, right? I think we can all agree that Himmler hated Jews, right? That's a pretty obvious. But he allegedly, went to visit one of these mass shootings in the East and got physically ill and had to leave. There's another guy named Baksalevsky who was, responsible for lots and lots of mass murders and was present at many of them. And he got evacuated for hemorrhoids. And his physician also noted in the chart that he was having flashbacks to mass killing sites. And what this says is not that these people weren't awful people, but that at some level in their psyche, some part of their psyche recognized that at least there was something gratuitously gross about what they were doing, if not wrong. And I'm not saying that Himmler thought that what he was doing was wrong, but something there. He wasn't a sociopath, I guess, in that sense, because he had some kind of empathetic reaction, even if it wasn't sympathetic, right?
But it's come up so often on these shows, and the same with James now on We Have Ways. It's that everyone wants everything to be black and white. He's the evil one. He's the good one. This is the good tank. This is the bad tank. And of course, the reality is it's much more complicated than this. And when you look at the people responsible for this, the millions that were behind this, they come on all sorts of levels of that spectrum. And some were absolute sociopaths and psychopaths, and some, and then other people were just kind of not swept along it. That's dismissing their involvement, but they're all sorts of different types of people on this, dealing with it in different ways, with different levels of tolerance for the mechanism they're part of. But again, for us, grouping them as all being sadists is much more convenient for us. It's a better label.
And to sum this up really quickly, we just know, just by percentages of human beings, most human beings are not psychologically abnormal. As you point out, certainly if you were, excuse me, and we know examples of this, the Third Reich was a great place to be because you could sort of self-select into positions where you were allowed.
Yeah, there are some very scary people who rose to positions of incredible authority because their natural predilection for being violent and sadistic was found a home in the Nazi regime, and we don't,
and you also
Mengele and those kind of people,
Yeah, and you also have the people who were sort of frighteningly normal, but then evolved into
became those people. Yeah.
Anyway,
we're moving on, and this is just your photo you put there, of people celebrating Christmas. Your life went on outside of these acts, is what you're saying. That these some of these perpetrators weren't living in a world of just murdering people. They would go and do something murderous, then go back home and play with their kids on the living room floor with a toy train, and life would go between those kind of worlds.
Yeah, and this is from somebody mentioned Ordinary Men in the chat. This is the unit from Ordinary Men, while they're in Łódź in Poland, and they're guarding ghettos, they're organizing deportations. Later on, they'll be murdering people, and they're also celebrating Christmas because why wouldn't they? I mean, they're not like murderous psychopaths 24 hours a day. Anyway.
No, fascinating stuff. So moving on. So this is another one that perhaps I hadn't thought about before, about the German businesses, because I think this ties in to this idea we all have of the many millions of Germans who apparently didn't know it was happening. Those who lived near to extermination camps or near to processing centers who said, I didn't know it was happening. But actually, as you said, without the support of the other nations, without the support of German business, it couldn't have been as efficient as it was. So you're going to elaborate on this for us. But yeah, German businesses were deeply complicit in all aspects of the Holocaust. You've got some examples here so I'll let you tell us what we're looking at.
So this is just a map of the IG Farben, and IG Farben became a massive industrial conglomerate with lots of different German companies. Some you may recognize today, like BASF, other chemical plants, Siemens. And this is just a map of where they have plants all over Germany and occupied Europe. And they're sort of the one that gets the most, you may have heard of them already. They get the most attention because there was a whole subsequent trial at Nuremberg based around the IG Farben. They had a plant. Auschwitz III Monowitz was a self-contained factory at Auschwitz. And they're the most famous. But what I think is really important to highlight is that, again, this complicity is at all different scales. So Krupp is using Jews on the assembly line or in various ways. The V2 rockets production, the tunnels. Most people die creating the tunnels, not actually working in the factory, because they're carving these tunnels with their bare hands out of stone. But then you have things like this. So this is also from my new book project, where you have Jewish inmates of the camp that I'm working on being forced to demolish the Jewish cemetery. And you can see they've got blocks where they've broken the tombstones. But if you look very closely, you'll notice that the truck has a name on it. And that's like a local small construction firm who is using Jewish labor and or Jewish building materials that's creating these building materials out of tombstones. And you go to Germany, and you may have a small farm that has 2 or 3 forced laborers. And they may not be Jewish. They may be forced laborers from Poland or Ukraine or someplace else, but they're slave laborers. But it's a business, and it's being used at all different levels, right? And that's just slave labor. Then you have all the companies that are providing products to the Nazis, but also to the final solution, up to and including Zyklon B, which a perfectly acceptable fumigant that's used to delouse barracks and uniforms and this kind of stuff. It's a pesticide. There's nothing wrong with it as that in that sense, but it becomes used obviously at Auschwitz and other places as a murder weapon, and the company knows this. The company knows that it's delivering because it's sending these massive quantities. I mean,
way more than they would need. How many
exactly.
times do these barrack blocks need to be sterilized, given how much we're sending to these same locations? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's the equivalent of when, you know, a prospective terrorist is uncovered because they've ordered, you know, 700 tons of fertilizer, and you know that if they were actually just fertilizing a field, they wouldn't need that much, that kind of thing. So we go to the next. This is the one I like to point out to people because I think it's the most chilling. But it's the company Topf & Sons, and Topf & Sons was a sort of a family business that became, you know, relatively successful before the war, providing crematoria for a variety of different purposes. So first for slaughterhouses to deal with offal and remnants of animals being slaughtered. And then as cremation became acceptable socially in the 1900s, it began supplying crematoria to funeral homes. And then, you know, as the concentration camp system develops, and then later as the extermination camp system develops, there is a need for industrial body disposal. And the Nazis turned to, you know, an existing company in Germany, Topf & Sons, that was providing this product. And so you start to see Topf & Sons with the brand name, you know, on these ovens in a variety of different camps all across the system. And that in and of itself is pretty awful, we can imagine, because, you know, eventually they know what they're using this for, right? But then I think what really shows the depth of complicity by German business is they modify their designs to function better in the specifically concentration camp environment. What do I mean by that? Well, two things. I'll give you two examples and then we can move on. One is, if you notice on the left, that example of a crematoria from a funeral home at the top there, that advertisement, that's pre-war, by the way. It's square, right? Because when you cremate someone in a respectful, normal way, they're in a coffin of some kind, and you slide it into the oven one at a time, right? It's completely consumed, all the ash taken out, a certain amount of ash is given to the family, then the place is, you know, industrially cleaned and sterilized for the next person, right? That's sort of if you wanted to know the ins and outs of cremation, that's how it should be done. Well, if you look at the cremation ovens at most any concentration camp you go to, first of all, you'll notice that the opening is rounded. It's not square anymore. And one of the reasons that it's rounded is because bodies are being burned without a coffin, and they're being stacked. So multiple bodies are being burned at once. So if you have a rounded opening, you can fit more people in. And this is a material evidence of the company changing its design to address the needs of its client, who in this case is the SS. And on the right here, you have sort of the natural evolution of that, which is it's an illustration from a patent application from the same company, Topf & Sons, for the creation of a multi-story cremation oven for Auschwitz, where you see those sort of slanty lines are conveyor belts, which would allow bodies to sort of move along these conveyor belts down into the oven to keep the oven burning all the time at a very high temperature. Because one of the problems that the Nazis experienced at Auschwitz was that the limiting factor to how many people they could kill was actually body disposal. They could murder 1,000 people in an hour, but they couldn't get rid of the bodies that quickly. Not to mention the fact that you start to see in some of the designs by Topf & Sons things like exhalation fans. Well, you don't need an exhalation fan unless you're trying to extract gas vapors from a gas chamber. And we also know, and I'll finish with that, but we also know that officials, engineers from Topf & Sons travel to Auschwitz to supervise the installation of their products, right? Which in a normal world makes sense. If you get a boiler, you know, the boiler engineer comes out and puts it in your house because he knows how to install it and test it and make sure it works properly. Well, the Topf & Sons engineers are doing the same thing, except it's in Auschwitz. And by the way, in order to make sure they know their product works, they have to wait for people to be gassed so their bodies can be disposed of. So they're there for the entire process. Okay, I'm done with that.
Wow. I mean, it's just chilling. This should be a quick one. I think, I guess.
Very quickly.
So number 9, the participants in the July 20th assassination attempt on Hitler were largely not motivated by Nazi crimes. Now this kind of comes into this kind of, I find this rewriting a little bit of the whole history of that. I mean, for those who don't know, we're talking about Valkyrie and the plot, but I'd never kind of perceived it from that Holocaust aspect in a sense, because I always think of it because I'm a Normandy guy, I think of it in the kind of whole Rommel connection. That's the angle I come at it from. But I found that very interesting. So share a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, and this is something that I want to be clear. You know, there certainly were individuals in this group, and there were, you know, in the end, there was a large group of people that are murdered for their participation or alleged participation in this. There are some who are ideologically motivated from a moral perspective, but not to the extent that I think a lot of people like to imagine. Most of the military officers are by and large conservative, politically conservative people. They're anti-democratic people. They are intervening. Many of them were in favor of Hitler when things were going well. And what they're really revolting against is Hitler running the war effort into the ground in their minds. You know, the idea that he's just ruining any chance for Germany's victory, well, victory at all, but let alone victory, but even some kind of negotiated settlement that would prevent the complete catastrophic capitulation of Germany. You know, this is what they're interested in doing. They're not motivated by opposition to Nazi crimes, by and large. You know, they're not upset about the Holocaust. At least not predominantly, right?
But in your study and work with this is a thing. Then people have somehow managed to sort of try and use this as an example of, well, there were good people within Germany who had seen what was going on and were trying to stop it. So therefore, we can't dismiss the whole country. Is that what happened?
It's one of those. I think it's a question of, you know, people in search of heroes, and there aren't a lot of them when it comes to the resistance against the Nazis within the Third Reich by Germans. Certainly Stauffenberg, I think, and I'm not an expert on him, but he did have kind of a moral change of heart, and I think he probably was, opposed to also the Holocaust crimes. But if you look at some of the people involved in the plot, you know, some of the next slide shows some of them. You know, they're not great people. Archer Neba was the commander of Einsatzgruppe B. So he was responsible for one of these massive killing squads in Belarus. And he tried to sort of reinvent himself afterwards and claim that he really wasn't that involved, but he's deeply complicit in the Holocaust. Georg Thomas, was also deeply complicit. He's the one that came up with the Hunger Plan, or was involved in coming up with the Hunger Plan, which was designed to starve between 30 and 40 million civilians in Eastern Europe. And Eduard Wagner was the quartermaster general of the German army, and he, beyond coming up with the German POW policy, which we know is horrendous, worked hand in hand with Reinhard Heydrich to coordinate the Einsatzgruppen killing with Wehrmacht units before the invasion of the Soviet Union. You know, so these are not great people. And then even Rommel, right? Because people love to throw Rommel out there. Rommel is sort of like the last great socially acceptable Nazi to sort of be a fan of. Number one is his role, if there was one, in July 20th.
So say if there was,
it's very, very tenuous, and at best, it looks like he was sitting on the fence to see if it worked, and if it worked, he would have been very happy to assume some.
Yeah, just wait to see if the wind changed direction, and then he might join in. But yeah,
which is not particularly heroic. And also, when he was in charge of the Africa Corps, there was an Einsatzgruppe in Africa, which was positioned to exterminate the Jewish populations of North Africa, and it had officers attached to Rommel's staff, and it had the war gone differently, Rommel would have been even more deeply implicated, by presiding over these Einsatzgruppen. And as it stands, he still presides over the construction of the Atlantic Wall, much of which was accomplished by
slave labor.
Labor from Eastern Europe. So anyway, you get the picture here.
Yeah, I mean, and that would be a whole separate program we could do at some point about the maybe the needs to find some sympathetic figures within this regime to somehow make someone along the way feel better about it. I don't know, but we'll move on from it right now. We'll go down a rabbit hole. But this is, I think, is the most important thing we're discussing, and the most heartbreaking and the most staggering is that most of the very worst Nazis escaped all punishment for their crimes, because I think most people, if you asked them on the street, would kind of think that most people were brought to justice for this because of the knowledge of the Nuremberg crimes. I mean, we know some people simply didn't survive the war. Hitler at his own hand, of course, famously. But you wanted to bring this one as your final point, so clearly it's important to you.
I think it's really important. It's also my next book project, but it's also important for a couple of reasons. One is to really have us think about our concept of justice and what justice looks like, but also to recognize both the real and constructed motivations for why this doesn't work, right? So I'll try to sort of cover this in a couple ways. One is to understand, first of all, that, and this is not to sympathize or to condone what happens in the sense of the failure of justice, but everyone, I would argue, everyone who's listening to this podcast or this channel presentation knew more about the Holocaust coming into this than a lot of the investigators after the war. And so, we have to keep that in mind, that, a lot of people that escape justice, at least initially, do so because the people, if there are people looking for them, they don't even know to look for them. Like the Taubman Sons people. I mean, like, it takes a while to figure out that these are people that we might want to look for. Not to mention the little guards from all of the other camps all over the world, all over Europe. Not to mention you have the massive demographic, jumble that is post-war Germany. You have all these expellees, ethnic German expellees from Eastern Europe that are flooding into Germany. You have all of the liberated forced laborers and concentration camp victims. It's just a big mess, and people are moving all over.
Yeah, we've got. I mean, there's no food. There's a displacement camps all over Europe. There's a Cold War brewing. There's war fatigue within the Allies. Although they've been victorious, everybody wants to just fuck off home and put this thing behind us. A lot of stuff is happening. 45, 46, 47, which is causing this situation, I guess.
Yeah, and you have the very real logistical problems of just, we're talking about a paper era, where how do we get information? There's a wonderful anecdote that I read in, I think it was in Frederick Taylor's book. But basically, towards the end of the war, a Nazi official in Munich wrote out to a paper maker, paper pulp maker plant factory owner, and said, we're gonna bring you some paper. We want you to pulp it. In other words, destroy it. And they bring over 50 tons of paper. And this guy, who wasn't a Nazi, he opposed the Nazis, he took a look at some of the documents and realized it was Nazi party files. And so he actually doesn't destroy it, which is how we get the Berlin Document Center, because this one German doesn't destroy 50 tons of Nazi party files and SS records, which then becomes obviously very useful later on. But you can imagine what would happen if that had been destroyed, right? So that we have the logistical and the sort of the good faith arguments for why it's difficult to prosecute these guys. But then there's also some other problems, which are there very quickly. There is a reticence to, I think, embrace or understand the depths to which the Holocaust and the Nazi state impacted everybody in Germany. The Nuremberg tribunals were great in some ways. They certainly highlighted some of the most important people in terms of responsibility that were left over. But for many, they sort of allowed kind of us to draw a line under it and say, okay, we prosecuted these people. Let's move on with sort of coming together and that kind of thing. And so that's a problem. There's an increasing, as the post-war period develops, there's an increasing reluctance to want to dig into this because it becomes very nasty. It's easy enough to say that, Himmler is bad and Goebbels is bad, and these very senior people are bad. But once you start looking at the German army, for example, or even more normal or lower ranking SS people, your sort of population, your target population expands, and you start getting a lot more people's brothers and fathers and uncles, and it hits a lot closer to home. Then you have in 1949 the Germans regain autonomy.
Yeah.
So the occupation sort of technically ends at that point. The Germans become responsible for prosecuting Nazis. And there are lots of, I'm not going to get into the details because we could have a whole show on this, but there are lots of sort of legal issues that the Germans throw up that make things difficult to prosecute, things like statutes of limitations, or what kinds of crimes can be prosecuted. And then the Allies also, in the 50s, drive a series of amnesties for some, even Nuremberg people, some of the worst individuals. 14 of the 15 convicted Einsatzgruppen leaders receive some kind of amnesty. 7 get released immediately when the amnesties come out. 16 of 20 defendants in the second Einsatzgruppen trial also get their sentences commuted or released. As a way of, I guess, sort of drawing a line under it. I think it was Konrad Adenauer that said, we can have justice or democracy in Germany, but not both.
Yeah.
This idea of, it becomes very problematic. And then you have the most egregious example to leave us with, I suppose, are the people that basically stepped right back into their pre-war occupations. From pediatricians who had participated in euthanasia program killing mentally handicapped children, and they go right back to being pediatricians after the war, to Einsatzgruppen and Gestapo leaders who go back to being policemen. And so one of the problems that a lot of the early investigators, German investigators who were investigating with goodwill these Nazi crimes, one of the problems they encountered often was that there were literally police officers on the inside that had information. Like a very famous former SS and Gestapo guy, when he was arrested, they found his own case file on his kitchen table, along with lists of all the witnesses against him and people that were being interviewed and were going to be interviewed. And then, of course, you have the problem of, if you get to trial, at least in the up until the 60s or so, a large number of the judges had also been judges during the Third Reich. And even if they were interested in maybe, being more just, many of them were worried about what happens if someone brings up the fact that I was also a Nazi. So the end result is that guys like this guy, Fritz Katzmann, who was the higher SS and police leader in Lviv and responsible for the murder of probably around 440,000 Jews in Galicia, he survives all the way through the end of the war, and it's only on his deathbed he reveals who he actually is. Because he came back to Germany, he took a false name, and lived unmolested his entire life.
And the last we could do those stories, and there's so many offshoots of this. You're talking about the complicity of the German businesses. Von Braun goes to the USA to set up the American space program, conveniently ignoring some of the areas that he had been involved in and knew about, and slave labor and what have you. So there's a whole lot of it's a very murky period in history that isn't clear cut. And I think I want to ask. There's a couple of questions from viewers that I'll ask you, but one I want to ask you myself is that does it matter that we didn't bring these guys to justice? And I'm asking that not necessarily thinking that's my opinion myself, because we put another 50, 100, 200, 300 Nazis on trial. It doesn't bring back the 6 million and the 5 million others who were killed. It doesn't save anybody. What good would have come out of it? I'm asking that, not necessarily believing it. I just want to know what your opinion is to that.
Yeah, I think it's a worthy question, in the sense, because I know you're asking it in a good way. I think number one, there's something, and without putting too much of a sort of overly idealistic bent on it. There's something important about being able to hold humanity accountable for its behavior. I think, and saying that, look, there are some things that are just, we will always continue to hunt you down and bring you to answer for what you've done, even if it doesn't necessarily have a prophylactic effect. It may not prevent future genocides, though I would argue that it does have that effect to a certain extent. But also just the idea that, that we have standards as a society. We have moral standards
as a species. Collectively, if we should stand up against something that is so inherently wrong and do our best to follow a system of justice. I mean, I think that's what I agree with, but I can understand people say, what is it? I mean, like these, whenever they find some 97-year-old book clerk or something these days and they put him on trial, I'm always torn what my brain tells me I should feel about it. I'm conflicted somehow about that whole process, and that chapter will come to an end, I guess, sooner rather than later.
I think with regards to that, I mean, this is Waitman's view, not the view of the German judiciary or the International Criminal Court. But there's no statute of limitations on murder.
True.
Even in the German system, and frankly, I think you should always live in fear of being prosecuted. And if you are prosecuted, we should put you in jail and you should die there. It doesn't mean we should execute you, but we should put you in jail and keep you alive so that you can endure being in jail. And one of the things that does come out of this is the Nuremberg Code, which has gotten a lot of really bad misinformation during the COVID situation. But the Nuremberg Code about forced experimentation and medical ethics, I think, is a very, very important piece of the medical profession today. And I think you can find lots of analogies to that, even if they're not that direct, that come out, particularly when you have an entire system, an entire society that gets involved, like the Holocaust. But I want to answer other questions. I'll be quiet.
Yeah, I mean, the one I'm going to go back to is Scott Grimwood, who's a regular viewer, and it's how common was it for Eastern European Jews, in particular Polish Jews, to be sent to Germany as forced labor?
This is a really good question, and it's something that I think a lot of folks don't understand as much, the forced labor in Germany scenario, because there's a lot of non-Jewish folks that get sent to be slave laborers in Germany. Not as many Jews, and it depends, right? Because Jewish slave labor in Germany itself is generally confined to, they live in a camp, or a factory environment, and that's where they labor. Whereas Polish and non-Jewish forced labor, can be hired out to live on a farm or, make a road or that kind of thing. Partially because the Nazis don't want Jews running around the countryside. They like to keep them away from Germans as much as possible. You do start to see influxes of Eastern European Jews into what we call Western Europe, I suppose, in two scenarios. One is as the war effort begins to sort of go downhill and they need more and more labor to do things, and also to clear rubble, for example. A lot of concentration camp labor is used to clear rubble after bombings. And then as the fronts are collapsing, there's a very bizarre scenario, a very bizarre phenomena in which the Nazis, those that are of this bent, view Jews as a labor resource. So when they evacuate Auschwitz, they do take pains, again, not without like lots of them dying on death marches and things like this, but to evacuate their labor with them, with some kind of idea that this will be useful later on. And we need to keep this group of people as laborers, and as everything begins to collapse, 43, 44, 45, they end up sort of clustered in Germany, which is where you get the highest death rates, at places like Dachau and Buchenwald, are generally during this period of when like thousands and thousands and thousands of people are being consolidated in a place that never had that many prisoners before. And many of them are laborers in this sense.
So one more from Willie Robertson, who pretty much watches all my shows. easy one to answer, I guess. The tattooed serial numbers, were they only for those in Auschwitz or widespread throughout the other camps?
Yeah. So the tattoos are almost always only an Auschwitz phenomena. Auschwitz. And Auschwitz, we could do a whole show on Auschwitz, which I'm sure would be super exciting, but also super grim. But Auschwitz is a unique camp in the sort of, in some ways, in the constellation of concentration camps, because, as I said, it serves those three purposes. But the tattooing is something that sort of was done there, and it's also interesting to point out, that anyone anyone that you see with a tattoo, was initially selected for survival in the camp, because they didn't tattoo anybody that went to the gas chambers. Because
Good
why
point.
would you? I mean, there's no point. So it's a little bit of interesting trivia there.
But it's definitely influenced our perception of the whole Auschwitz process. And another question from Trent Tolenko, who is an expert on radar and Japanese radar and stuff out in the Far East. But were Jewish slave workers an SS only phenomena, or was there a dogfight between the SS and other Nazi organizations for slave laborers?
Oh, this is a fantastic question. And you may have mentioned, if you're here in the beginning, or may remember when I talked about this sort of bureaucratic infighting. And this is absolutely an area, because an area of infighting is over Jewish labor, and also broadly, what do we do with Jewish wealth in general? Because for many Nazis, the Holocaust could be a very lucrative endeavor, right? And so, for example, just to draw from my own work, the camp that I work on was actually divided into two camps. It started out initially as an organization that made uniforms and desks and furniture and stuff like this for the German army, but it was run by the SS. And so the SS was very interested in, and this, we're talking now about the WVHA, or the economic main office of the SS. Were very interested in maintaining some level of ultimate possession of Jewish labor. So Jewish labor is used by lots of organizations, from the Luftwaffe to the Wehrmacht to private civilian firms, et cetera, et cetera. But the SS fought a little bit of a battle with Goering in the 4-year plan and the economic office over this, but eventually won out. But the idea was that you would have to then pay the SS. So the SS basically rented out laborers, whether they be Jews or non-Jews, to various organizations and concerns. So you would essentially pay for your Jewish laborers, and the SS would make the money. Even to the extent of, and it's very cynical, but the SS would also require that you pay an allowance for each laborer for food and clothes, and stuff like that. But of course, they didn't really, that money didn't go towards that.
Yeah, clearly.
But it was a way.
That was a good response. I'm going to just finish with one question for myself, and I fear it won't be easy to just summarize in a quick response for me. But at where we are now, 2021, the survivors of these horrific events are not going to be with us much longer. What would you like to see as the next kind of step in the collective understanding of the Holocaust? What will be happening over the next 2 decades, and what do you want to happen with our understanding of these events?
Well, I mean, I think I'll take the second half of that question first, because I think it's actually the easiest. I mean, I think anything, and like the shows you're doing, being able to integrate the Holocaust into other histories and into other narratives, so that it becomes something that everyone has a pretty good understanding of, and realizes that it's not a Jewish thing by itself. It is, of course, has a lot of predominantly impacted Jews in some ways, but it's also has resonances in other things, like World War II, like medical ethics, all these kinds of other areas. I think it's important that our understanding of the Holocaust is broadened to incorporate all of these other experiences and perspectives, beyond just the Elie Wiesel night, the Auschwitz, the Anne Frank, right? And again, I'm not poo-pooing any of those, but they tend to be sort of the standard, at least entry level kind of narratives.
Well, this is essentially what I talk about. James Now talk about, the History Hack talk about. It's that simplifying of history, that it's come down to, as I say, this tank is better than that tank, or the Holocaust is one thing, and of course, like anything else with it, it's not one thing, it's many different things. And as you've expertly explained, it's your experiences in one part of Europe is very different to experiences elsewhere, and yet we have this collective image that is powerful and haunting, but there's much more to it than that. And I think this week has been truly interesting in terms of broadening my understanding of it and taking me into areas I perhaps didn't really want to go. But I think it's important to read about some of these things, and we will bring things to an end. I mean, it's been great, and I wish I was at Warfest to come and get my book signed, but I'll buy you a beer one day over in London or something, or Newcastle. You can come to Normandy. But it's been a tough week dealing with this. I'm kind of looking forward to getting into Battle of Britain week, which is a little bit of a sort of more regular topic for me. But at the same time, I think this has been very important what we've done here, and you've breaking it down to these 10 points has been really, really interesting. So good luck with your next book, and when it's done, please come on to World War II TV and talk about it. And folks, I do recommend this, the one of Waitman's books I do own, and along with The Final Solution by David Cesarani. It's the two books that I read in the recent couple of years that had a profound effect on me. This, because it was all mostly new to me, whereas the Cesarani book was more kind of saying things I was familiar with, but in more detail. Anyway, so this is it. Thank you very much. I will see everybody on Sunday for the commencing of Battle of Britain week. 2 shows that day. James Jeffries with one and Victoria Taylor with another. So for everybody else, enjoy your weekend, folks. And thank you very much, Dr. Beorn, for joining us. And thank you, everybody, for watching us. And thank you for sticking with us during what has been a rather traumatic and at times dramatic week. So thank you for watching. This is Paul Woodard from World War II TV saying thank you for your time.